The moment my mother-in-law leaned toward her sister and whispered those words, I was standing close enough to hear every syllable over the string quartet. She used to stock shelves at Walmart. Keep that in mind when she starts talking. I was holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched. The Harlow Estate glittered around us, a grand hall with vaulted ceilings, ivory draping, and 200 guests gathered to celebrate my in-laws' 40th wedding anniversary. Senators, surgeons, people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. My husband's family moved through that room like they owned it. They did not know that I did. I set my glass down on the tray of a passing server and walked toward the event coordinator, a young woman named Tessa who had been managing the evening's logistics since 4 in the afternoon. "Tessa," I said quietly, "I need to speak with the venue manager." She blinked. "Of course, Miss Calloway. I'll get him right now." My mother-in-law's name was Dottie. She was 71 years old, 4'11", and had spent the last 6 years making sure I understood exactly what she thought of me. Not loudly, not with cruelty you could point to, just the steady, patient kind, the kind that works its way into your bones before you realize what's happening. A comment here, a look there. The way she turned to my husband at dinner and asked about his day without once glancing in my direction. I had married into her world at 27. Her son, my husband, was a good man caught between two people who saw each other very differently. She saw me as the girl who used to ring up her groceries. She was not entirely wrong about my past, but she had no idea what I'd done with the years since. Let me go back to the beginning. I grew up in Clover, South Carolina. My parents ran a dry cleaning business on the edge of town, and by the time I was 13, I was working the front counter after school. That was just how things worked in our house. You contributed. You didn't complain. You figured out how to make things run better than they did yesterday. I was good at school, math especially. I had a way of seeing patterns and numbers that my teachers kept pointing out, writing things in the margins of my tests like exceptional and college material. I applied to 12 universities. I got into 3. I chose the one that gave me the most financial aid, which was Clemson, and I studied real estate finance because it seemed like the place where math and the real world overlapped in ways that actually mattered. Dottie's family, the Harlows, had owned the Harlow Estate property for 3 generations. Her husband, my father-in-law, was a man named Philip who had built a quiet empire in commercial real estate across the Carolinas and Georgia. He was the kind of man who shook your hand once and remembered your name for 20 years. I genuinely liked him. Dottie was the one who made it clear that liking was not enough. Belonging was what mattered, and in her estimation, I had not earned it. When my husband, whose name is Theo, first brought me home to meet them, she asked me, in front of the whole family at the dinner table where I had gone to school. When I said Clemson, she nodded slowly, as if she was deciding something. When she found out I'd been working at Walmart during college to cover my living expenses, the nod became a slight press of her lips. Not unkind exactly, just categorizing. For 6 years after that dinner, she categorized me. At Thanksgiving, she'd tell the story of how Theo had been so taken with the girl he'd met at a friend's party. You know how these things happen. As if I were an accident that had attached itself to her son. At Christmas, she redirected conversations away from my work with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. When I mentioned a property deal I was working on, she'd ask Theo about his golf game. I worked in commercial real estate acquisitions at first. Then I started investing small amounts of my own money, a storage facility in Greenville, a small retail strip in Fort Mill. I was careful. I was quiet about it. Some of that was strategic and some of it was just habit. The same habit I'd learned growing up. Keep your head down, do the work. Don't announce yourself until there's something worth announcing. The thing about Dottie was that she never asked me a single direct question about my career. Not once in 6 years. What she knew about me she'd assembled from fragments overheard at family gatherings, and what she'd assembled was a picture that stopped at 2018 when I was still junior level and splitting rent on an apartment in Charlotte. She didn't know about the fund. My grandfather on my mother's side had emigrated from Barbados in 1971 with $40 and a trade. By the time he died, he had a small amount of savings and a will that left everything equally to his 5 grandchildren. My share was $41,000. I was 29. I put it into a DST, a Delaware statutory trust, that gave me a fractional interest in a Class A multifamily property in the Raleigh-Durham market. That was my first real move. From there, I rolled proceeds into a 1031 exchange, and then another, and then I started structuring my own deals through a holding company I registered in Delaware under the name Harlow Asset Group. I kept my name off the public-facing materials deliberately, not because I was hiding anything, but because I'd watched enough of the industry to know that a woman who looked like me, 31, black, from a dry cleaning family in Clover, wasn't always taken seriously in rooms where she announced herself too early. So I let the work speak first. I let the returns speak. I let the track record build until it was undeniable. By the time of my in-laws' 40th anniversary gala, Harlow Asset Group held partial or full ownership of 23 properties across 4 states, including, through a series of acquisitions I had completed 18 months earlier, the Harlow Estate itself. Dottie did not know this. When the venue manager, a man named George who had been operating the estate for 11 years, found me near the side corridor, his face was composed in the careful, professional way of someone who understood exactly who he was speaking to. "Ms. Bakji, Calloway," he said. "What do you need?" I told him quietly. He listened. He did not argue. "Of course," he said. "I'll need about 15 minutes to coordinate." "Take 10, I said. I went back into the main hall. Dottie was standing with her sister and 2 women I recognized as longtime friends from their garden club. She was wearing a champagne-colored dress that she'd had fitted 3 weeks earlier. I knew because Theo had mentioned it, and she looked genuinely happy. It was one of the harder things about Dottie. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had spent her entire life sorting people into categories and had simply never been confronted with the cost of that habit. I was about to change that. My husband appeared at my elbow. Theo had his father's eyes and his mother's talent for reading a room, and he read mine immediately. "What's happening?" he said. "Something I probably should have done a long time ago." "That's not an answer." "No," I agreed. "It's not." The lights shifted slightly, just a degree, the way they do when the sound system reconfigures. One of Dottie's garden club friends noticed first, looking up. Then the string quartet stopped mid-phrase. A murmur moved through the room the way wind moves through a field. George appeared on the small, elevated platform near the bar and spoke into a microphone with practiced calm. He explained that there had been a scheduling complication with the venue, that the remainder of the evening's programming would need to pause, that guests were welcome to remain in the reception area while the matter was resolved. He used the word ownership once. Just once. But once was enough. I watched Dottie's face. The confusion came first. Then something that looked like irritation. Then she turned, scanning the room, and her eyes found me. And whatever she saw in my expression made the irritation go still. She crossed the room toward me, and the crowd parted for her the way crowds always do for women who have moved through them with confidence for 50 years. "What is going on?" she said. Her voice was low. She was too practiced to make a scene. "The venue has new ownership," I said. "They've requested a pause in the event." "New ownership." She repeated the word slowly. "What does that have to do with our anniversary celebration?" "The new ownership is me, Dottie." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was the quiet kind, the kind that happens when something restructures itself inside a person. "That's not possible," she said. "Harlow Asset Group acquired the estate 18 months ago as part of a portfolio expansion into hospitality-adjacent properties. I've been meaning to mention it." Philip had appeared at her shoulder. "My father-in-law." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before, something between surprise and what I can only describe as assessment. The look of a man who had spent decades evaluating deals and had just encountered one he hadn't seen coming. "Ellie," he said. "My name is Eleanor, but he'd called me Ellie since the first Thanksgiving. It was one of the small ways he'd always made me feel like I belonged, even when his wife had not. "Philip," I said, "you own the estate." "My holding company does, yes." He exhaled once. Then, very quietly, he said, "How long have you been in acquisitions at this scale?" "About 4 years at this level." "Started smaller." The 1031 strategy gave me the acceleration I needed. He nodded slowly. It was not a nod of disbelief. It was the nod of someone doing math in his head and not liking how fast it was coming out. Dottie looked between us. Her sister had drifted closer. One of the garden club women was watching from a discreet distance. "You did this on purpose," Dottie said. "Not a question. I acquired the estate because it's a strong asset in a growing market," I said. "I paused the event because I overheard you tell your sister to discount what I say because I used to stock shelves." She went very still. "That was a private conversation." I was standing 4 feet away. "Eleanor." Theo's hand was on my arm. I could feel the tension in it, the way he was trying to calibrate what was happening, whose side to stand on, whether there even were sides. I turned to look at him. He was the person I'd chosen to build a life with. He was also a man who had watched his mother categorize me for 6 years and had mostly hoped that if everyone was polite enough, it would sort itself out. "She told her sister to discount me," I said. "Not to take my opinion seriously, because of where I came from." He looked at his mother. Dottie said nothing. "I think," I said, "it's time to have an honest conversation." "Not here." "But soon." George appeared at a respectful distance and I gave him a small nod. The light settled. The quartet began again. The event would continue. I hadn't come to humiliate anyone in front of 200 guests. I'd come to make sure one person understood what she had been doing and what the actual cost of it was. What happened after the gala was quieter and more complicated than the moment itself. In the car home, Theo didn't speak for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. When he finally did, he said, "I didn't know the extent of it, the holdings." "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, because for the first year I wasn't sure it would amount to anything, and after that, I paused. After that, I think I was used to keeping it separate. I'd gotten used to being underestimated in that house, and I think part of me didn't want to make the success about proving something. I wanted it to just be mine. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to be terrible about this." "I know. She's going to tell the family you ambushed her. She can tell them whatever she wants." He glanced at me. "You're not angry?" I was. For about 4 years I was very angry. Now I'm just done pretending it wasn't happening. Dottie did not call me the next day, or the day after. On the 3rd day she called Theo, and from what he told me, the conversation was mostly about her feelings, about being blindsided, about embarrassment, about the fact that important people had been in that room. She did not, apparently, say much about the comment I'd overheard. Theo's sister, whose name was Annalise, texted me directly. The message said, "I heard what Mom said. She's been doing this for years and I've never said anything and I'm sorry. Can we talk?" I appreciated that more than I knew how to say. What I hadn't anticipated was the conversation with Philip. He called me on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual. He said he'd been thinking. He said he wanted to understand the structure of what I'd built, not because he had any claim to it, but because he was, and this was the word he used, impressed, and he thought he owed me the honesty of saying so. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He asked about the 1031 strategy. He asked about my approach to market selection. He asked how I thought about risk at the portfolio level, and when I explained my framework, he got very quiet and then said, "Your father-in-law is a little embarrassed that he didn't know this about you." "You never asked," I said, not unkindly. "No," he said. "We didn't. What followed was not a transformation. That's the thing about real life. People don't transform. They shift. Slowly, and sometimes they shift back, and sometimes the shift holds." Dottie came for dinner about 3 weeks after the gala. She wore the same champagne dress, which I thought was either oblivious or deliberate, and I still don't know which. She brought a pie she'd made herself, which was her way of offering something without using words. We ate dinner. We talked about ordinary things. At some point during the meal, she looked at me across the table and said, "Theo's father tells me you have a very particular mind for this industry." "I've worked hard at it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't realize. I should have asked. Those were not the words I'd spent years imagining. They weren't an apology exactly. They were an acknowledgement. which in Dottie's language was closer to an apology than most people get. I said, I know. There's a version of this story where I tell you that everything was fine after that she became my champion, that the family changed, that Theo and I moved through the world without any of the old friction. That version would be easier to write and easier to read. What actually happened was more like this. Things got incrementally better. Dottie still occasionally said things that landed sideways. Theo still sometimes found himself caught in the middle. Annalise and I became genuinely close, which was something I hadn't expected and valued more than I could have predicted. Philip started occasionally calling me just to talk through deals, which was its own kind of remarkable, and I kept building. Callaway Asset Group closed 4 more acquisitions in the 18 months after the Gala. We expanded into Tennessee and Virginia. I hired 2 more analysts and promoted someone from within who I'd been watching for 2 years. The portfolio crossed a threshold that I had once thought about in purely theoretical terms, the way you think about things when they feel too large and abstract to be real. I still have a picture of myself from 2015, standing behind the customer service counter at the Walmart in Rock Hill. My name tag said Eleanor. I had a second job at the time, answering phones for a property management company in the evenings, trying to learn the industry from the ground up, trying to understand how money moved through buildings, through contracts, through the specific language of commercial real estate that nobody teaches in school because they assume you'll learn it from your family or not at all. I did not learn it from family. I learned it from being in the room and watching and asking questions that people found mildly annoying because they thought the answers were obvious to anyone who mattered. I keep that picture because I think it's important to remember how things actually start, not with an origin story that makes sense in retrospect, not with a clean arc or a mentor who believed in you, just with a name tag and 2 jobs and a set of numbers in a spreadsheet that you're trying to make mean something. Dottie's comment, the one about keeping my past in mind when I start talking, she never directly addressed it, not to me. Theo told me she'd said something to him about it, something that sounded like regret filtered through several layers of pride, but I don't know the exact words and I've decided I don't need to. What I know is what happened in that room when George said the word ownership. I know what I saw in her face, and I know that she knew, in that moment, that she had spent 6 years cataloging a woman she had never actually looked at. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by people who are supposed to love you. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates slowly, layer by layer, the same way debt does, small and manageable, and then suddenly, one day, larger than you realized. You smile through family dinners. You redirect conversations. You decide that explaining yourself is not worth the energy, and then you decide that again and again until not explaining yourself becomes its own kind of weight. I am 34 years old. I started with a part-time job and a grandfather's savings and a way of seeing numbers that I inherited from no one and taught myself. I built something real, slowly, in the years when no one was watching. I don't say this for the applause. I say it because I know there are people reading this who are in the middle of those years, the years before anyone is watching, the years when you're working 2 jobs and asking questions that seem to irritate the people you're asking and wondering whether the numbers in your spreadsheet will ever mean what you need them to mean. They can. Not because of luck, and not because someone finally believed in you enough to give you a chance, because you kept going in the years when the belief had to come from inside your own chest, where no one could see it and no one could take it. Dottie called me last month. She asked if I'd be willing to look at a small property her nephew was thinking about purchasing. Not professionally, she said, just as family. That word landed differently than it ever had before. I said yes. I've thought a lot about the moment I heard Dottie say those words. Not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said about me. It wasn't, not even close, but because of how casual it was. The way she said it while holding a champagne flute at a party being held in a building I owned, with the complete confidence of someone who had never once considered that she might be wrong. That casualness is what stays with me. When people underestimate you, they rarely do it with malice. Dottie wasn't cruel. She was a woman who had sorted the world into categories for 71 years and had simply never been given a reason to question her system. And for 6 years, I gave her none. I smiled at dinners. I redirected. I told myself it wasn't worth the energy to explain. And then I told myself that again. and again, until the silence became its own kind of agreement. That was my part in it. I want to be honest about that. There's a version of the story where I was purely the wronged party, where Dottie was the villain and I was the patient, blameless person waiting for justice. But that's not quite true. I stayed quiet for 6 years not only because explaining myself felt exhausting, but because some part of me was still operating from the old fear. The fear of a girl from Clover who was used to being underestimated and had quietly decided it was safer to prove things silently than to risk being dismissed out loud. What I've come to understand is that silence, when it protects your ego instead of your energy, is just another form of avoidance. The work I did, the 1031s, the acquisitions, the holding company, that was all real, and it required real discipline and real intelligence. But I kept it hidden longer than was healthy, not just from Dottie, but from Theo, from myself in certain ways. I'd convinced myself I was being strategic. I think I was also afraid. What changed at the gala wasn't the power I had. I'd had that power for 18 months before that evening. What changed was my willingness to let it be seen. Philip called me afterward and said something I keep coming back to. He said, "You carry information like it's something you might have to give back." He meant it as a gentle observation, not a criticism. But it landed like one. The useful kind. Intelligence without the courage to use it is just a private comfort. Discipline without the willingness to stand behind what you've built is just a habit. And integrity, the real kind, not the polished version you perform for people you're trying to impress. Integrity means saying what is true even when the room is full and the stakes feel personal. Dottie asked to keep things quiet. She didn't say that directly, but it was in how she framed things afterward. The conversations she had with Theo, the careful way she discussed the misunderstanding. I didn't agree to keep it quiet. I also didn't go looking for an audience. I just stopped pretending the thing hadn't happened. That distinction matters more than it sounds. You can choose accountability without choosing cruelty. You can let people face what they've done without deciding it's your job to make them suffer for it. That's not weakness. That's the harder choice, the one that requires you to stay clear-headed when every instinct says to either fight or disappear. I still work long hours. I still sit with spreadsheets at 10 at night, running numbers, looking for the thing I might have missed. The work hasn't gotten easier. I've just gotten better at trusting that it means something, not because Dottie finally said so, or because Philip was impressed, or because any external measure of validation arrived on schedule, because I kept going in the years when no one was watching. That's the only proof that ever held.